It's Don here from the board. Thanks for coming along and checking out this video. So as you may have seen from the title of this video, I want to talk about keyboards and microphones. This goes back a really long time. I've been talking about it on my podcast, and if you've followed us on Instagram, you would have seen that a while back ago I had also tried to get a brand new mixer. There were things that went wrong with that. It got sent back to the store, and then I kind of got a bit of an upgrade to the next level up item. And the background context for all of this is that I want to record a number of videos and look at the behavior of different microphones and how they relate to keyboards. There is a reason for this, and it really comes down to that there are so many people out there now doing videos on YouTube, doing streams on Twitch, doing videos on Instagram, and what we often see and hear are sound tests. Sound tests are vital. Sound tests are a critical part to our community because they give you an indication of what either a switch sounds like, what a keyset can sound like with the materials and the design of the profile, the thickness of the walls of the keycap, and how a keyboard sounds, and how the keyboard sounds relating to its plate material, its case design, its case material, its thickness, and all of these other factors in between. Now, why is that important? It's important for the enjoyer and the enjoyment of the end user and their overall experience. However, something that has sort of come up from all of this over time with me looking at and understanding keyboards and keyboard science is that there are often times that people will get a board, they will build the board, and then they will make the comment that I can't get my keyboard to sound like somebody. And that got me thinking on why is that occurring? And it occurs more often than not. A lot of people will be like, I can't get rid of that sound. That's fine, because you can fix that if there's an identifiable problem. But then when people say, I've done everything exactly the same as person X, but my keyboard doesn't sound like theirs. Theirs sounds like blah, and there's a description. Mine sounds like blah, and then there's a gap between those descriptions. And for me, with a science background, with an engineering background, what I was able to narrow down through my thought processes was the fact that there's a good likelihood there's information loss from the sound as part of the audio chain of the person recording it to the person hearing it. There are some end user aspects that will also be really important that we aren't going to be exploring as part of this series of videos. And things like that is mostly going to be related to speakers and headphones. Because no matter how true your recording is and the representation of real life at the time of its recording, what you hear it through on playback will significantly impact the way it sounds. And the second one is that your own ears and the frequency response of your ears and the quality of your hearing will also impact that. However, if we assume that whatever you're listening to, all keyboards will be heard through the same speakers, through the same headphones, and your eardrums are not behaving differently between keyboards, those two factors should be fairly constant for you as the individual. And what then that boils down to essentially is the data that's coming to you. Now, I have a lot of microphones now because I have a podcast. I started off choosing a good quality entry-level prosumer level microphone to do the podcast 4 years ago. And I never really had too much issue with it. And I know from interviewing people over the years and talking to people on Discord and hearing other people's streams on YouTube and on Twitch, different microphones give you very drastically different results in quality, in tone, in timbre, and so on and so forth. And that's what I kind of want to start off the series with. So in this particular video, I'm going to be just exploring the concept of a frequency response, the frequency response graph, and having a look at the ones for the microphones that I've been able to acquire that I want to use as part of this experiment. So I saved up my pennies. I want to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters who help pay the bills for the podcast, and the little bits of money that I have left over after using it to send out monthly prizes and things like that, I've just been squirreling away and buying mostly used microphones to build up for this particular experiment, as well as buying the new mixer and then getting the extra cables and so on and so forth. So currently in my collection, I have my original Rode NT1. I now have the Rode NTR ribbon microphone, which is what you're hearing me on right now. I have a Audio-Technica 2020 with the XLR cable input. I also have the Rode NT USB, which is a USB microphone, and I have a Blue Snowball Ice, which is also a USB microphone. So I've got 5 microphones at a different range of prices, which have inherently different quality levels, and I intend to record the same keyboard, which I'll be using my standard desk, my daily driver keyboard, as a control board across those different microphones and having a look at how they sound and what their recorded graphs will look like in, for example, Audacity. I may expand that to looking at switches individually and things like that, but we'll get to that in time. I'm just wanting to kick this off. So I want to talk about the frequency response and frequency response graph, because that's super key to all of this. I'm going to switch over monitors now to have a look at what a frequency response graph is. And this is the Audio-Technica 2020 frequency response graph. The way that I've read up and learnt about frequency response is how well the microphone is able to replicate or represent the signal at a particular frequency. And in one of the videos that I was looking at, if your frequency response is completely flat across the entire graph, all the way across, it means it represents all frequencies equally. And they call it, the pass-through, right? So what it comes in passes through to the recording software exactly as it is. When it goes higher, it means it has an affinity for that frequency, which gives it a stronger response. And if it's lower, then it mutes that frequency, and therefore not as much of that signal is going to pass through. Now, why does that matter on the other side when you're recording it or when you're broadcasting it? Well, obviously, if you have a sound source that's really, say, bassy, for example, but your frequency response is very poor at passing that through, it will actually require more bass signal to get through the microphone to sound like it has a lot of bass, because it's been dampened, it's been reduced, that signal's been cut away. Whereas if you've got something that's got a really high frequency, and that same microphone which has a poor low frequency response but a good high frequency response, it'll skew that representation and make it sound a lot tinnier, a lot brighter, because those high frequency sounds just go straight through the processing of that microphone into your recording software. So if we have a look at this, typically there's going to be a decibel range on one side, and then it'll be the frequency on the other. And you'll see on the 2020, it seems to be a little bit lower than this mark, I guess, on the lower frequencies, and then it's fairly flat across the mid-range frequencies, and then it starts to pick up a bit on the high frequencies, but at super high frequencies, towards the 20K, it falls off again. Now this graph is really super deceptive because it doesn't tell you where it is relative to a 0 dB value. It's only telling you that the height between this is 10 decibels. So effectively, it's giving you an approximate error margin of 10 decibels. So it is kind of maybe tight-ish, if you want to call 10 decibels tight in how well it behaves. But this isn't really a great response because it's not giving you an accurate amount of information to compare to other graphs. Now from the 2020, if we move to the blue snowball ice, you'll see this is what I'm talking about. You've got a 0 decibel, a minus, and a plus in 5 decibel increments. So from the low frequency, this is a really bad microphone for picking up because it's muting at 10 decibels. And then when we hit sort of that mid-range, starting to go in towards the high range frequencies, it picks up at this 1 kilohertz a +5, and then there's a bit of a wobble here before it falls off, just like the 2020 does. So this is a much better graph because you can compare it to other ones that actually give you value scale. The 2020 doesn't really help you there. This is the Rode NT1, and they represent this with it in 10 units, but you've got, I think it's 5 marks, so you've got 2 decibel units here in between, and it's claiming a little bit of a drop off on the lower frequency, and it's very flat. It's super flat all the way up to about the 3K range, and then there's a little bit of pickup, and then it sort of falls off again. We get into the NTR. It's very neutral at 0 for the lower frequency, and it actually gets down. It reduces its ability to pick up as the frequency goes higher into that mid-range. It comes up a little bit, and then it starts to fall off again on the lower range. I'll talk about this one a little bit later. And lastly, the NT USB starts off a little bit muted, comes up, represents well in the middle, and then it represents really well, and it picks up really good on that higher frequency range and falls off again towards the end. But when you've got this axis on the side here, you can, for example, overlap them, right? You can line them all up and you can actually chart it out and see how they're comparative to each other. The only one that doesn't do this is the 2020, because the 2020 only tells you the range of 10 decibel. But is that a 0 mark there? Is that a 0 mark there? Is that a 0 mark there? I honestly can't tell you because I don't know. It's not provided there. So with this in mind, when we do a typing sample, my intent in Audacity is to do a standard text typing sample. I've read that Audacity has the ability to break down the frequencies in a sound sample and chart it in a graph. We'll be able to line that up against the frequency of, these microphones, for example. But what would be really interesting to find out is, what's the distribution like on a keyboard? Is there a lot of sound proportionally in a particular frequency range? Now, human hearing has a very specific range, and we know that, for example, for certain animals like dogs, they can hear at a much higher frequency than we do as humans. Dog whistles and stuff like that we don't hear, but they hear and react to. So when you look at some of these, you have to think about, where is that range that we're hearing, and where is the range of the item that is generating the sound? Because that's what we want to know about. That's what we want to line up. If a keyboard is representing between, say 100 hertz to 3 kilohertz, then we only care about a microphone that will represent that keyboard accurately in that range. Anything above and below that, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't generate those sounds, for one, and if it's above or below our human hearing range, then it too also doesn't matter. So they're the factors that we have to consider here. Now, the reason why I actually went with the NT1 for podcasting originally was because look how amazingly flat that is. I don't talk in the 20 hertz range. So it doesn't really matter if my voice is not representing well at that low frequency. I don't know what the upper range is for my voice and what that frequency is, but it's actually really, really flat. It's only a 2 dB variance here between this flat line and that peak. However, when we look at the NTR, this is where it gets really interesting, because ribbon microphones traditionally have a reputation of being more accurate and representative of true life than other microphone types, historically speaking. I think the reason why the graph shows this decreasing is because it's actually more mimicking what our human hearing picks up. And this is where I'm talking about that at those really high frequencies that our hearing normally doesn't pick up, the microphone's not going to pick up and pass through, because it's kind of designing itself to filter out those really high frequencies that we're not going to hear. And it's not going to boost them, because if this red line was actually going up, right, it would be picking up those frequencies and representing them louder than they actually are, and therefore, giving us a false impression of what those frequencies would be. And even still, when you consider this drop-off of frequencies, it's a little bit harder and it pushes a little bit harder, but that's what? 4 decibels? Okay, nothing massive. When you get to those super high ranges, it's a minus 10 decibels. So it's suppressing 10 decibels. 10 decibels is actually quite a lot as far as sound energy goes. And I do notice that because when I record in Audacity, I have to actually boost the amplification of the sound signal that I'm recording during my podcasts. So there are some of the things to consider when you're choosing a microphone and when you're listening to somebody who's doing a sound test, because whatever equipment and microphone that they're using is going to have a frequency response pattern. And if that pattern is not very good, then it's not going to give you a true representation of that keyboard. Whatever they're recording that goes into the software, you're hearing the microphone's interpretation, versus if you took that same keyboard and it was in front of you and you heard it direct without the microphone processing and altering that pattern in front of you. Now, in terms of game plan, I sort of tried to play around a little bit with the setup. I was discovering that typing on my keyboard with the microphones sitting on my desk, because I've only got one mount for a boom arm here with a shock mount, the vibrations were actually transferring into the microphone. Now I do have a filing cabinet here on the side that I'm thinking about how I can rig up a stand based off it, like a plank that hangs off and weighted so that the microphone can sit separate to the desk and be dampened by everything else in the filing cabinet, and then having the microphone hang over the keyboard for me to do that recording. In terms of fairness, Audacity can just do raw amplification, and therefore the different gain and pickups of just pure volume, Audacity can sort that out by doing the amplification to 0. Now, that I know has its pitfalls, but we'll go and have a look at it later and compare it between its actual recording versus its amplified recording. But it will help us understand a little bit as well when we look at the raw data and the frequency breakdown versus when it gets amplified, and so on and so forth. The only reason why I talk about that and bring it to an even ground is the different microphones will have its own differences in its sound generation, and while I will be able to plug them into the same single mixer, because I've got 4 XLR inputs here, the gain and levels on that to get a good signal, I'm undecided whether I'll set them exactly the same or if I will adjust them to get a good signal and then using Audacity to level that playing field. We'll see how that goes, and when I've got opportunity to do that. And also, I'd probably be recording a 10-second period, for example, of background noise, because my mixer has inherently a noise floor that should be removed as part of that test, as well as any background noise from the environment that needs to be removed also for that testing. So that's just a quick introduction in regards to what this series will be. I don't have a time frame on exactly when I'll achieve that, but I do want to let you know it is something that has been on my books a really long time, and I do have the equipment now. It's just setting up the way to rig it up and to do the recording, to start doing the analysis and talking through what those results will look like, and just food for thought when you're watching somebody streaming and what you're hearing versus what you hear directly in real life. Alright, thank you for checking out the video. If you like this kind of stuff and you want to see those videos, then please hit that like button so I know that this is worthwhile. Please hit that share button. If you got somebody who's complaining about how their keyboard doesn't sound like their favorite streamer's keyboard, so they can have an idea about the things that they should be thinking about when they make sound comparisons. And of course, hit that subscribe button and bell notification so you'll be able to find out whenever this series moves on with its next video. Thanks very much for checking out the video, and of course, as usual, until next time, happy clacking.